All right. Looks like we're now live for the first AMA of the new year 2025. I've already got one question lined up. I'm going to put in a shameless plug as well. I've got two classes, online classes in the Study with Sadler Academy that people might be interested in, particularly if you're into Hegel or you're into ancient philosophy. So next Saturday, I've got a one-day seminar, which is divided into three portions on Hegel's master-slave dialectic and everything coming beyond it and situating it. And we'll talk about some other takes on it as well. And then on Thursday, we're starting the 12-week Ancient Philosophers on Friendship class that I taught last year as a 10-week version. We've added some more texts and thinkers to it. So you see the links to it. If you're interested in that, you can check it out. All right, let's get on with the questions. So first one is from not an academic. In what sense does the for itself take up emotions, and how is it entirely responsible for it or them? I suppose I find his description of consciousness as translucent both fascinating and the key to understanding this. So I'm guessing since nobody was actually named, that what you've got in mind is Jean-Paul Sartre, because a lot of people use that terminology of the for itself. It goes back all the way to Hegel. So Hegel, as far as I know, I mean, he talks about emotion as Gefühl, right? But he doesn't trust that very much. Sartre does talk about human emotions quite a bit. So I'm guessing that's who you actually have in mind. I'm not sure in what sense does the for itself take up emotions. The for itself is human consciousness, right? And we are partly in itself, our facticity, as Sartre calls it, the things about us, like the fact that I'm 54 years old. I don't really have any choice, control. I can take positions on it, and that's for itself. But the fact that I am 54 years old and I've got this body and stuff like that, although the results of previous choices is no longer for itself. And let's use that as an example, because I could have all sorts of emotional takes on that. Like I could be sad about the fact that my body is aging, and if I'm lucky, I got 30 years left. If I manage it well, I could be happy about the fact that I've made it this far. I could be fearful about the future. I could be angry that, I'm stuck in this middle-aged body, right? And so, Sartre is kind of at an extreme in terms of thinking about emotions. He's not saying that on a surface level we're responsible for every single emotion we experience. As a matter of fact, he is somebody who does take quite a bit from Heidegger, and Heidegger thinks that mood or affectivity, it's also translated as attunement, is a really important aspect of our lives. And this goes all the way back, by the way, in Heidegger to Aristotle's Ethics, Rhetoric, book 2, which he calls a hermeneutic of everydayness. And so Sartre is kind of a heritor to that. By the way, Sartre also considers himself kind of a Cartesian, and Descartes himself has a really great treatise on the emotions called The Passions of the Soul, which Sartre is familiar with. So we are responsible for our emotional responses and comportment. And the more that we understand them well, the more we can, you could say, proactively or intelligently or thoughtfully direct ourselves. So we can say, why am I so anxious about this? What should I do about these sorts of things, right? Most people are not really that conscious about what's going on. They feel things. They're not sure why they feel things. And Sartre would say that some of them are in what he calls bad faith, right? Where they have concealed from themselves their role and responsibility in it. But there's also the vulnerability of ourselves to the world's, right? So All right, let's move on to some other ones. Here's an easy one for me to answer. John Fleming's, what do you think about Edward Feser? I don't think anything of him because I read, a little bit of his stuff and I was like, yeah, okay. He's a Thomist and he's got a shtick. And I don't think that what I'm reading here is better than mid 20th century Thomas, so I'm not going to spend any more time on this guy. I used to read his blog like a million years ago, but I never found him all that interesting. He seems to have developed a kind of like cult following, you could say, as happens with late 20th century, early 21st century philosophers who are quite public, but I don't find him very interesting at all. And given that we have limited time in our lives, I would rather just read Thomas Aquinas than read somebody like Feser telling me what he thinks Aquinas is saying. All right. Well, this is a clarification from not an academic in context of, again, are we talking about Sartre, his phenomenology of the body, which I found a bit difficult to comprehend entirely? Well, you're not going to comprehend it entirely from an AMA session. So you may be setting the bar a little bit too high there. Yeah, I mean, we are bodies for Sartre, and our emotions are certainly bodily connected. You don't have to be Sartre to think that. You can be Aristotle or the Stoics or Thomas Aquinas or all these other thinkers throughout time. So there's nothing really that mysterious or distinctive about that, I would say. Shiru says, how do I get into philosophy of logic? Okay, so it depends on what you mean by philosophy of logic. If you mean the part of philosophy that we call logic, I would say go to the library, get yourself a couple logic textbooks and read your way through them and, do some of the exercises and see what it produces or how it pans out for you. And then you'll see where you want to go after that. Now, if you mean philosophy of logic, philosophical speculations on the nature of logic, well, there's an entire history of that discipline going all the way back to, in a formal way, Aristotle and through the Stoics and Megarians and into medieval logic and into early modern thinkers. And there's a lot of different pathways going off in different directions and looking at logic in different ways. So I don't know. I would say that you could pick any particular entry point that you want and it could work out for you. It's not as if you have to have the right place to start because there isn't like a philosophy of logic. There's a whole bunch of different people saying different things all the way down to the present day, right? All right. Jose says, do you know what was the last philosophy Roman schools before Christianity took over? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there. What was the last philosophy that Roman schools were teaching? Is that what you mean? Or what is the last philosophical school before Christianity becomes a dominant force? I mean, one thing that you have to understand is there's no moment where Christianity took over. The early Christian period, so 2nd century, really to the 5th century, Christianity is coming on the scene. And it's not as if there's a thing called Christianity. There's lots of different ways in which it's being understood and practiced. And it's being, worked out in a couple major different cultural spheres, the Western Latin speaking sphere, the Eastern Greek sphere, Coptic Christianity in Egypt, who, by the way, influences the Ethiopians, and then Syriac Christianity all throughout the Middle East, so it's not as if there's like one homogenous thing called Christianity. And the early Christian writers, I mean, think about Justin Martyr or Lactantius, or, some of these other important thinkers, they've had a philosophical education, and they're often incorporating things from pagan philosophy, some of which they actually find quite attractive. Clement of Alexandria, for example, Platonism and Stoicism, major importance in his works, and he actually sees Greek philosophy as a preparation for Christianity. So I don't think there's an answer to the question the way that you've actually framed it. I think it's better to think of it as like Christianity and philosophy, because early Christians called Christianity the philosophy, at least some of them did. You should think of them as sort of interpenetrating each other, and as at least in the West, Christianity essentially incorporating things from pagan philosophy that they thought were cool or they liked, and oftentimes preserving things that they didn't like so that they could critique them. If you think about Lactantius's work on the anger of God, we owe the Epicurean famous trilemma to Lactantius preserving the words of Epicurus in that work, right? Otherwise, we would have entirely lost that. That's where we got it from. So I think the picture is a lot murkier and more complicated than that. Blue Sky, what do you think of Byung-Chul Han? Are you familiar with The Crisis of Narration? The only book I've read by him is The Burnout Society. It's okay. It was decent. I worked through it with a client. He's got interesting things to say. As I was reading it, there were parts where I was like, well, that's really insightful. And then other parts where I was like, well, that's clearly off base. And I imagine his work is probably all like that. And there's literally, thousands of people publishing books out there. So I don't read everybody's books or stay on top of everybody, but he seems to be doing some interesting things, So yeah, I might be reading him more often. My friend Davoud is really big on him and has read quite a bit. So you should probably go check out Davoud Gozli's channel. And he may have actually tackled that book for all I know. All right. Real Gay Machine. Okay. How does someone contribute to the philosophical canon? Do they need a strong grasp of the ideas that came before? Okay. So you might be asking one of two kinds of questions there. If you're asking, how does somebody contribute to it today? Because you're thinking that you're going to contribute to the philosophical canon. The answer is you get super, 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 super lucky, because there's, like I said, there's thousands of people out there publishing things. Just to take, the previous person, I don't know if Han is going to become part of the philosophical canon. And there is no philosophical canon. There are canons, right? There's a whole bunch of different ones, depending on who you ask. There's no one single one. If you're asking how historically different thinkers became part of a growing body of literature that we call a philosophical canon, the answer is it depends. So some of them, by virtue of being considered wrong, you think about Spinoza, for example. For a while, Spinoza, in his own time, was viewed as being so wrong that you could show that somebody else was wrong by showing that their ideas basically dovetail with that of Spinoza. And then a couple centuries later, they can't get enough of Spinoza, right? And you can say, well, what's going on there? Well, with each particular figure, you're going to get a different set of answers about how they became part of the canon. Obviously, some figures got in there early on and have had some staying power, but it varies from time to time. In the present, we think of Plato and Aristotle, and then whatever Hellenistic philosophers and Roman philosophers are going to read. And then we get to the really big metaphysics again with Plotinus. And that's a very 19th century onward kind of view, because in the 18th century, they weren't reading Aristotle that much, right? They were reading Cicero instead. Hume talks about that in his inquiry concerning human understanding, right? He actually says the fame of Aristotle is decayed, that of Cicero will last forever. So there isn't a how does somebody contribute to the philosophical canon. Do you need a strong grasp of ideas that came before? Well, sure, but not necessarily all of them, because otherwise you might be just kind of reinventing a wheel and not doing it quite as well as people who came before you. All right, Elijah, good to see you. Which ideas in Lacan's seminar 10 to 20 do you think are somehow incorrect? Do you agree with his ideas of anxiety, modal logic applied to enjoyment, etc.? Which ideas in these seminars do you use often? The answer is none. I mean, I'm not spending a ton of time on Lacan. And the seminar that I like the best isn't in that group. It's the ethics of psychoanalysis, right? And so I can't really answer that question. Do I agree with his idea of anxiety? That's a very complex idea. Which parts am I supposed to agree or disagree with? I will say this about the modal logic thing. Lacan never met a diagram or mathematization or, algorithm that he didn't like, but the uses that he's making of them are so weird and off center that I actually think they're distractions, but that's me, right? All right, John, when you studied ancient Greek, which dictionaries and lexicons did you prefer or find interesting? Did you use Beke's etymological dictionary? I'm laughing because this is not the sort of thing that people, prefer or find interesting. You use the materials that you have. So dictionaries and lexicons are kind of standard. You've got the littles, right? The little, middle little, big little. I also will sometimes, depending on who the authors are, I've also got this New Testament, which is good for Koine, but also useful for other authors of that time. So Thayer's thing. I've got a Bailey's Greek to French dictionary that I use sometimes. But a lexicon is a lexicon is a lexicon, right? You're using it basically as a tool. They're not interesting, and you use the same ones as everybody else uses in the field. What's more interesting is Greek grammar, right? So there you would actually want, and I don't know if there's other, better ones out there that are more contemporary, but the sort of standard thing for us at the time was Smythe's Greek grammar, which was really nice because it gave you lots of examples and it's well organized and it's, as it should be, connected with comparative Indo-European linguistics. So for like interesting changes that were taking place, they would also tell you what's happening in Latin and Sanskrit and Gothic and other languages that we have as well. And you never stop using lexicons, in part because every author who you read has got their own vocabulary, right? So that's kind of important. Socrates' great-grandson, what does Aristotle mean by phronesis? How does one develop it? Well, we usually translate it as prudence or practical wisdom. You should read Nicomachean Ethics, book 6, where he discusses this in detail. And it also comes up in the politics. It also comes up in the rhetoric and other places. But that's like the locus classicus, the main place that you go. And practical wisdom is a decent enough translation. He tells you that it includes, it's not just defined as, but it includes being able to figure out what the good is for oneself and for human beings in general. It also includes sort of comparative work, being able to decide what's better, what's worse, right? How do you develop it? A number of different ways. You can develop it partly through hanging out with other people who are phronemon, right? Who have some phronesis. You develop it partly through thinking about your experiences and the dumb mistakes that you made and what went wrong there and what you can do better the next time. And, whether or not you need the virtues. There isn't like a recipe for how do you develop it that Aristotle actually provides you with. But we could say that, if we're thinking about things in an Aristotelian way, it's like any other sort of habitus or hexis. You develop it through doing things repeatedly, but not doing them in a mechanistic sort of check the boxes kind of way, but a thoughtful way. And, you're also in some respect using your phronesis, which is only partly developed, to try to acquire more phronesis, right? Paul McLaughlin, do you foresee any areas or fields for revolutionary new ideas in philosophy? I don't foresee them, but I'm sure that some people do. I think we've already got enough ideas, more than enough, that most people can't even get to more than a few of them. But people love novelty, don't they? We were just actually talking the other day, me and a friend of mine who's here, by the way, about a trendy new philosopher who everybody was talking about a while ago. Now nobody really seems to care about, and I won't mention who it is because we could pick so many of them. And they have some new vocabulary and some new ideas, and who gives a shit, right? It's sort of like the music industry. Who's the top new artist? Ooh, we got to listen to them. Don't listen to the old stuff. Listen to them. Well, a lot of times the old stuff is better than the stuff that's coming out right now. A lot of like revolutionary new ideas turned out to be kind of busts, at least in terms of what I've seen over the last half century or so. So I don't give a lot of thought to that. So I'm probably not a useful person to talk about that. All right. Here's a really interesting question. Sunny Blue. If you could extend the life of a philosopher who perhaps died prematurely to complete an unfinished work or witness a historical moment, who would it be and why? Yeah, that's a good one. So we got to think about like who died younger than they ought to have, who didn't get to like see the full development of their philosophical perspective and work. And I've got a really good one in mind. One who would have changed intellectual and perhaps even broader history had he lived a lot longer. So you may or may not know this, but Boethius, one of these early Christian era philosophers who was a Roman, was, in the power structure, and then found himself condemned to death and wrote the Consolation of Philosophy while he was at that villa in house arrest. Now, Boethius had a project in mind. He could see the writing on the wall that these barbarians are taking over. Roman culture is still going on, but people aren't really reading Greek. If we're going to keep reading philosophy, we're going to need to translate these Greek texts into Latin. And so he had the project of translating all of Plato's works and all of Aristotle's works into Latin. And he succeeded in translating the Timaeus, Plato's text, and Aristotle's categories and on interpretation. But he didn't have time to translate any others because he got executed, right? So imagine if the Latin world from the 6th century onward had full access in Latin to all of Plato's and all of Aristotle's texts, in addition to having a lot of Cicero on hand, to having Seneca, to having Epictetus's Enchiridion, to having quite a few other important thinkers and texts. That could have been pretty significant, right? We don't really know what the effects would have been, but I think that would be kind of a cool one. And, you know, there's other people like, well, what if Kierkegaard hadn't died fairly young? What if Blaise Pascal hadn't died fairly young, and he put the Pensées together into the actual discourse book on apologetics that he was intending to do? I mean, even Descartes died fairly young up there in Sweden. He could have accomplished quite a bit more. Spinoza, of course, died young, you know, inhaling the glass particles messed him up. Who else? I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft is another great example, you know. What would she have written if she hadn't died shortly after childbirth with, you know, her child with William Godwin? She might have gone on and done a lot of really great stuff. So, yeah, that's a great question, I would say. Real Guy Machine, if you could only read a few of the 20th century French philosophers for the rest of your life, which ones would you pick and why? Well, Gabriel Marcel, definitely, right? I mean, how many is a few? I guess we should cap it at maybe 3. So I keep going back to Marcel over and over and over again. I still do really like Maurice Blondel, 19th century, 20th century. And then, you know, who else would I pick from there? I don't know, maybe Jean-Paul Sartre. He's got a lot of cool stuff. So does Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, Albert Camus. Actually, I would pick Albert Camus. Because he's a better novelist, and I actually enjoy his philosophical writings, and I think he was a much better person, frankly, than Sartre or de Beauvoir. So, yeah. All right. Socrates' great-grandson, do you like virtue ethics better than consequentialism and deontological ethics? And if so, why? So the proper answer to that is no, I don't like any of those, because those are pure abstractions, right? Those are the sort of things that we present poor students with in intro to philosophy or ethics classes, and we don't actually give them the real stuff. So consequentialism isn't a perspective. It's a whole family of perspectives. You can be an egoist like Ayn Rand and be a consequentialist. You can be a utilitarian like John Stuart Mill and be a consequentialist. And those are at antipodes from each other, aren't they? So that's a abstract, often sloppy way of thinking about these sorts of things. There's no such thing as consequentialism. There's no such thing as deontological ethics as such. And there's no such thing as virtue ethics as such. Instead, what we have are Aristotelian virtue ethics, Stoic virtue ethics, and we can go on and on and on. We have Kantian deontology. We have intuitionist deontology with, you know, W.D. Ross and Robert Audi. We have divine command theory as a form of deontological ethics. So it's not the sort of question that anyone really should be answering, because if they are, that's a sign that they love to live up there in a world of pure ideas rather than down here where ethics actually happens. Now, that said, yeah, I do like virtue ethics approaches better than utilitarianism or, you know, egoism or, you know, contractarianism or Kantian deontology. But I agree with Alistair McIntyre that if you're actually doing virtue ethics right, you incorporate stuff from utilitarianism and you incorporate stuff from Kantian deontology. He's got articles specifically on that where he's like, here's what we need to take from Mill. Here's what we need to take from Kant. So it's not like you put it, you know, your money on one or another of these. When you actually read philosophical texts and traditions, you see they're often drawing on a lot of this. And I think that is much more useful than for real life stuff than talking about these high level abstractions. Okay, here's a speculative fiction question from Ileana. What's the most interesting thing you remember from Cixin Liu's trilogy? I mean, the natural thing is, of course, the dark forest hypothesis, right? Because that's structuring basically the whole trilogy. But I think maybe the most interesting idea was that the Trisolarians, in effect, made a computer out of themselves. That's kind of an interesting idea to kick around, I mean, there's also like the vast cosmic scope, which you also see in Cordwainer Smith's Instrumentality of Man writings, that I think is pretty cool. It's like, not just millennia, but like we're talking about like hundreds of thousands, millions of years in scope. So that's kind of cool, I would say. All right. Sunny Blue, how can you navigate the challenges of absorbing the pain and suffering conveyed through world news and online videos, especially when it begins to take a toll on you and affect your relationships? Well, I mean, the number one thing in that is to realize that you have a choice and a responsibility about what you're consuming. Nobody says that you need to be watching online videos or, paying a lot of close attention to world news. That's up to you. And if you're finding that you're not able to watch that stuff without being ground down, then maybe you should stop watching that stuff. Who says that you have to, right? And if it's affecting your relationships, you can ask yourself, what is the good for my life? Is it caring about what's happening in Myanmar or Ukraine or Hong Kong or pick wherever else you want? Or is it my relationship with my friend, with my spouse, with my coworker, something that I actually experience every day that is real, that is in front of me? You can decide which of these is going to matter to you more. And you're a free human being. So you can decide how much, you don't have to like watch everything or listen to everything. You're not like betraying humanity by actually taking care of yourself. Now, it's good to be well informed about what's happening, especially if you're going to like opine about it. But yeah, sometimes you do have to restrict it a bit or be selective, right? Zoki says, do you have any details on the linguistic development of the term enactic and its meaning in our modern cultural context? I do not, because I've never heard of that. And it sounds like something that some Gretchen out there is trying to make the next fetch, to use the line from Mean Girls that I think is particularly apt for people doing theory, right? If you remember that movie, Gretchen keeps trying to use this word fetch as sort of an approbative word. And finally, Regina George says, Gretchen, fetch isn't going to happen. So I haven't heard enactic, but it's like all these other philosophical terms that people like to make up and say, ooh, this captures something. I don't know, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think we already have enough philosophical terminology out there. We're not like lacking for it. All right. Blue Sky, are you impressed by Hannah Arendt? There's something I find pretentious and limited in her sweeping points of view. Do you sense an Arendtian cult at work? I don't sense any Arendtian cult. I mean, who the hell would that be? Am I impressed by Hannah Arendt? Well, she certainly achieved a hell of a lot more than I have, right? And she survived some pretty difficult times. Is she right about everything? No. I mean, you read like her latest work, the one that she was still working on when she died. And, she's got some stuff in there. When you read it, you're like, yeah, you're getting Augustine and Epictetus and Nietzsche wrong here. But it's interesting, right? There's nothing that says with any philosopher that they have to be 100% completely correct or they're not worth reading. And, I I certainly read and sometimes even teach Arendt. I've worked through some of her texts fairly recently with some of my clients. Um, so she's worth checking out. Vegan Stega, I know you get the have you read ex-philosopher question a lot, but in spite of that, have you read Vico? And if so, do you have any general thoughts about his work? Yeah, I've read Vico. It's been a while since I've returned to him. And he's part of a cool kind of countercultural movement within philosophy that you could include Ernesto Grassi in the 20th century, a student of Heidegger, in. And I would say, people who are attentive to rhetoric and the topical dialectical tradition coming from like Aristotle through Cicero, like Chaim Perlman, with his new rhetoric. I would say those are people who actually think that the kind of stuff that Vico was into is quite important, and I agree with them. So I'm not going to commit to like being a Vicoian or anything like that, but I would say that rediscovery of the centrality of dialectical and rhetorical engagement, that philosophy isn't just metaphysics and epistemology first, is quite important. So Shen, what are my thoughts on John Donne's Scotus? What do you think of his impact to the theological, philosophical era of the High Middle Ages? Well, I would say he was one of a number of different important people in the High Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas is certainly just as important, as is William of Ockham. And Scotus and Ockham provide, Franciscan alternatives to the Dominican, like Thomas is right about everything sort of point of view. I don't spend much time working on Scotus, in part because I don't do a lot of stuff on High Middle Ages anyway. I do more stuff on Anselm and Boethius and Augustine and early Christian thinkers than I do late Middle Ages people. But if you like reading them, then go ahead and read them. It can't hurt you, right? All right. Favorite Russian or Slavic philosopher other than Shestov? I mean, with Shestov, because he's so uncommitted to consistency, you could say maybe you got a couple Shestovs, right? But that's kind of a cop out. I think that you do get a good bit of philosophizing in Dostoevsky's characters and in other Russian literature. If I have to be restricted to philosophers, then I'm not like a specialist in Russian philosophy. But I guess I would probably say Berdyaev, right? Because I've read his stuff, whereas I can't say that I've read a lot of other Russian philosophy. Farzad, why philosophy progress slowly? Because they take their time and they're careful about things. And because the word progress is one of those slippery terms that could mean anything you like, I mean, lots of people talk about progress. I don't know that a lot of the things that people think are constituting progress really do constitute progress. But, deep thinking takes a while to do. And why would you expect things that that take quite a while to be quick. Pirate ship, can we mix Hegel and Socrates? You can mix anybody with anybody. What you're going to get might turn out to be complete crap, and you'd really have to know Socrates through Plato and Xenophon, because of course the guy never wrote anything down, and Hegel well to do that. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but different strokes for different folks. So all right, Solomon, religious beliefs or attitude to organized religion. And there's a question mark, but I don't see an actual question there. So I don't know what's being asked. Farzad, what do you think about anti-natalism? I think it's kind of a fringe thing that edgy kids get into and disappointed middle-aged people get into, but that there's not a lot of legs there. It's interesting to read some philosophers who are anti-natalists, but anti-natalism to me seems kind of a boring crowd, Legati, Schopenhauer, people like that, they're interesting to read, but I don't think I would actually find hanging out with anti-natalists very interesting at all. Kishiji, people are curious about your answers. I'm curious about you. Do you believe in God? What are the basis of your beliefs? I mean, I've answered this many, many times. Sure, I believe in God, but that doesn't tell you a damn thing, because what conception of God do I believe in, right? There's all sorts of them. This word God can name all sorts of things. And, what's the basis of my beliefs? My beliefs don't have a basis. I'm not like a foundationalist where I start with my axioms are blah, 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 blah. I'm a human being who thinks. And so, the reasons why I believe things are going to be complex and interconnected and tied in with experiences, some of which are experiences of reading other religious thinkers, right? So there isn't a like, oh, I had this one experience this one time, or, oh, I read Chesterton and that converted me. People who say stuff like that, I'm always very suspicious of them. So, all right. Akram, what do you think about the concept or notion of the afterlife as believer and as philosopher, especially after the existentialist philosophy? I don't know. I mean, there is no existentialist philosophy. There's like a whole spectrum of existentialists, some of whom are quite religious, including the first existentialist, Søren Kierkegaard, right? So we've got Gabriel Marcel, we've got, all sorts of other people. I mentioned Berdyaev just earlier, Leo Shestov or Lev Shestov. They would be examples of people who certainly did believe in something like an afterlife and were major existentialist philosophers. So I'm not sure. I don't think the question actually makes much sense the way it's framed. I think that, when it comes down to it, we don't know much about the afterlife, and I don't really think much about the afterlife. I think much more about what do I need to do here and now, So, all right. Pirate ship. Boy, this is kind of a mess. The good is the most beneficial, but to you or the world, in parentheses, as I see, the ultimate good could be the lowest bad, like stealing, and the ultimate bad could be the lowest good, like shearing. I don't have any idea what the hell is being said there, so I'm not even going to try to take that on. Andre says, are you familiar with the work of Tibor Machin and Leszek Kolakowski? And if so, do you recommend any work of them to start reading? Kolakowski, I read some stuff of back in graduate school. Never heard of Machin, so no recommendations about that. Pirate ship, what do you think about Arab philosophy? I think that there is no such thing as Arab philosophy. There are a bunch of different Islamic thinkers, not all of whom were Arabic, some of whom were Persian, some of whom were other ethnicities. Many of them wrote in Arabic. Maybe that's what you mean. So we're thinking about people as different as Ibn Rushd or Al-Ghazali, all over the place, right? What do I think about it? It's cool to read it if you want to. As a matter of fact, here in Milwaukee, we have the Aquinas and the Arabs project that Richard Taylor at Marquette University started a long time ago, and people study that. I don't read Arabic, so I can only read these things in translation. And frankly, I don't have a ton of time to spend on more than, the thinkers who I'm already teaching and writing on and making resources on. So I don't spend a lot of time with it. But if somebody wants to study it, good for them, Real Game Machine, have you seen the YouTube channel Unsolicited Advice? What do you think about these trendy philosophy channels? I don't think anything of them because I don't watch them, because I spend very, very little time watching other people's YouTube videos, or my own for that matter, because I spend my time producing resources. We all get 24 hours in a day, ideally 12, 6, 8 of that is for sleeping, and then we got eating and bathing and doing all the other things that we do. So am I really going to waste my time watching a lot of other people's trendy philosophy channels? No. I've never heard of Unsolicited Advice, but it sounds like a bad idea to me, frankly, because I don't like when people give me unsolicited advice, quite honestly. And the few people's channels who I do watch tend to be people who I've known for quite a while. And, like I mentioned, Davud Gosli, check out his channel. Or I actually just recommended today Casper Rene Johansen, Danish philosopher. That's the kind of stuff that I watch. I don't watch trendy, philosophy. And we got to put philosophy in quotes there, because it might not even be philosophy. It might just be like quotes or something like that, for all I know. So, all right. William Evans, what can you tell us of the philosophy of the unattainable? Can't tell you anything, because I don't know what that is. Osco Isco, you ever going to release a magnum opus of your eclectic philosophy? I don't think you can have a magnum opus of eclectic philosophy. And I'm not a magnum opus kind of guy. I'm more of the I've got a project here and a project there and a project here, and we'll see how many of them I can, accomplish in the time before I die. Which, maybe I've got at best another 30 years or so, assuming that my health holds out and, the planet doesn't burn up and stuff like that, in which case all bets are pretty much off. So I'm not looking to do a magnum opus. All right. Bill Clinton. What do you think of the concept of being spiritual but not religious? Well, I think two things. I think that, first off, most people who say that are bullshitters, and they usually have some unresolved issues with organized religion that usually stem from their experiences as well as prejudices on their part. And they often get themselves into communities of other people who blather on about that kind of new agey stuff as well. And so when somebody says something like that, I usually just tune out, and I'm like, well, probably not much useful going to come out of this person. That said, is it possible to develop a conception of spirituality that would not be directly tied to one of the major world religions? Yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, you see philosophers doing that, like George Santayana, right? Arguably Nietzsche is doing something kind of like that. Pierre Hadot, who's got his, philosophy as a way of life, spiritual exercises, trying to resuscitate something like that. So I think it's possible, but I think that most people who use that terminology are just kind of bullshitting themselves and others, On the front, would you consider Žižek as a philosopher? Why not? I mean, there's tons of philosophers. I think that his early work was quite good. I think that now he does, sometimes he can be quite brilliant, but I think a lot of the time he's just kind of riffing nowadays. But that doesn't disqualify him from being a philosopher, does it? Why would we not consider him to be a philosopher? I'm not quite sure about that. Shen says, what do you think of Plotinus's, by extension, the Neoplatonist school impact on the early development of Christian thought? I think it's overblown. I don't think that Plotinus himself had a hell of a lot of influence. I think that Simplicius and Porphyry and people like that actually had a lot more influence on the development of early Christian thought. But there were many other authors in the background, because you got to remember, Neoplatonism is neo because it comes after Middle Platonism, and that includes Plutarch and Alcinous and all these other thinkers, and they're all looking to Plato. So early Christian thinkers are not getting their Platonism primarily through Plotinus. They're getting it from a whole variety of sources, So I think that a lot of times people like simple stories in the history of ideas, and usually the stories aren't that simple. So, where did, for example, Augustine get his understanding of Platonism from? Partly from Plotinus in translations by Ammonius Saccas, but also from other Platonists too, right? So, where did Philo of Alexandria, not a Christian thinker, but a Jewish thinker who actually influences Christian thinkers, was he getting it from Plotinus? No, that wouldn't make any sense. Where did Clement of Alexandria get his understanding? Where did Justin Martyr get his understanding? Was that from Plotinus? No. So I think that people like to tell stories, and the stories are often oversimplified. Socrates' great-grandson, could anxiety be a virtue if it helps enhance performance, facilitates social interaction, or contributes to moral thought and action? Or could an anxiety only be a vice? Why does it have to be a virtue or vice? Not everything's a virtue or vice. Virtues and vices are complexes of habits, which can certainly bear upon emotions. They do for the Stoics, they do for the Platonists, they do for the Aristotelians, they do for Christian thinkers. But not every emotion is a virtue or a vice. Why would you try to shove it into one of those? And just having good effects, like enhancing performance sometimes, because does anxiety always enhance performance? No. Right? Facilitate social interaction? Does anxiety reliably do that? No. Does it reliably contribute to moral thought and action? No. So, even if it did all the time consistently, would that make it a virtue? No, because you need more than that to be a virtue. So it's sort of a category mistake that you're making there. Anxiety is an emotion or a mood or an affect. It is not by itself automatically a virtue or a vice. Santiago says, any advice you would give to someone who's entering their 20s as a person and who's studying philosophy? Yeah, I would say, and this kind of jibes with some of the videos I've done in my quick takes. Don't let other people kind of boss you around and tell you what you have to read or what attitudes you have to have or how many hours a day you need to be putting in to studying or any of that, because none of them know, right? They're all just extrapolating from maybe what worked for them or what they think is cool. Some of them are lying about what they do. Oh, I read 8 hours a day. Yeah, bullshit. Most people don't read 8 hours a day. So don't get caught up in that hype, and don't worry about competitiveness. It's common at that age to feel a bit insecure about your own capacities and background and understandings. And so it's the same thing with other 20 somethings. And unfortunately for a lot of 30, 40, 50-year-olds as well. And it's easy to get caught up in this kind of like jockeying for position with people who in the long run really don't matter. So maybe that's a helpful bit of advice for you. All right, Abbas, what do you think about Leo Strauss? Worth reading? Yeah, sort of like Hannah Arendt, wrong about a lot of stuff. Interesting. People who are into him are really into him. I mean, if you want to talk about a cult figure, Leo Strauss really was a cult figure, right? There are people we call Straussians, and they often tend to be pretty conservative. It's interesting because a lot of the Straussians who were decent but not good philosophers have now become MAGA types. They've like bought the Kool-Aid complete, or drank the Kool-Aid completely, and bought into all of those ideas, and now their thoughts aren't even worth checking out anymore. But Strauss is worth checking out. I've occasionally where he's useful, I'll cite him in an article. Like I've got a piece that I published years and years ago on Thomas Hobbes, and Strauss has some interesting things to say about Hobbes and rationality, and vanity. So worth reading, not worth becoming a Straussian, I'd say. Joshua says, what, if any, benefit is there to learn other languages, to study philosophical texts? Well, the biggest benefit right off the bat is you can actually read the author in the original language and see whether the translators have taken liberties with what the person is actually saying. Because I can tell you this as a translator, translating is not usually all that easy, and you make choices, and some of your choices might make sense to you, but not make as much sense to another person. So it's good to be able to go back and see what they're saying. This, by the way, is one reason why I don't do work on ancient Chinese philosophy or Hindu philosophy or various schools of Buddhism or Islamic philosophy. I don't have access to those source languages, right? I don't read Arabic. I don't read classical Chinese. I don't read Pali or Sanskrit, right? So I'm always dependent on other people's translations. And I'm a little leery about like putting stuff out there when I can't read it. And I to be sure, yes, I've done some stuff on Kierkegaard, and I don't read Danish, but that's fairly close. And I do trust the Hongs to be getting stuff right. But classical Chinese, that's a whole different ballgame, right? All right, Shen, any thoughts on Eco? I'm getting a bit lost reading him. Okay, if you're getting a bit lost, then you need to come out of the forest. Eco is a dense writer, and he's very interested in lots and lots of different things. The one cool thing I will say about Eco, which I think for some people makes his books, his literature books, not as good, because Eco has like his philosophy and semiotics stuff and linguistic stuff, and then he has all of these novels that he's written. A lot of the stuff that's in the theory books, let's call them, is going to show up in the novels. So, The Name of the Rose or Foucault's Pendulum or The Island of the Day Before, you're going to have all sorts of stuff that's coming from his various other writings. So I don't know, maybe a good thing to do would be to put down the theoretical stuff for a while and go and read his fiction. That might be a nice way to do things, All right. Osho says, when Hegel says the unhappy consciousness, not conscience, wants to connect to the whole, is that like the absolute? Yeah, it's like the absolute. I mean, the absolute, there's let's say there's two absolutes, right? There's the absolute as it is for Hegel, which you get to not in the unhappy consciousness section, but only at the end in absolute knowing. And then in other works as the system comes together, right? And then there's the absolute as we think of it mistakenly as being the whole or the absolute at given times. And so in the unhappy consciousness, what's going on is the human being who's, now at a different stage past Stoicism, skepticism, the master-slave dialectic. They're now in this stage where they're trying to connect with the eternal, the absolute, the best, the good, and they're projecting it outside of themselves as something that's above them and different from them, an absolute other, you could say, to use later terminology. And they're trying to figure out ways to fill in that gap and to connect to it. And that's part of why it's an unhappy consciousness, because it doesn't work over and over and over again, right? But it's also because the consciousness at that shape of consciousness, that gestalt in that dialectic, is mistaken about its own nature and the nature of the eternal or the good or whatever you want to call it. And by the way, this is something that Feuerbach picked up on. If you read the Essence of Christianity, that's basically taking off where the unhappy consciousness is and saying Hegel got that part right? So absolute, this is I think you can generalize this. There's a lot of cases in Hegel's work, and a lot of people will they'll watch the half-hour Hegel videos and they'll be like, so Hegel's saying this, and they've got like this big theory about all sorts of stuff. And the proper response is Hegel is saying that consciousness at that point thinks this. That's not Hegel's whole point of view, which you get at the end of the work and through the totality of the work, right? So that might be useful to think about. Hobbit, what do you think about Osho? I don't think anything about Osho. Not an author who I read. Vanasgard, Plotinus wasn't that big a fan of Christianity. He wrote a polemic against the early Gnostic Christians. Well, he actually wrote a polemic against Gnostics in general, but yeah, he wasn't a fan of Christianity, but who cares? Right. All right. Hafez says, thanks for organizing these. You're welcome. Ia B. Polk says, can you make a video on William Lane Craig? Why would I? I mean, he's not that interesting. People asked me about Fesser earlier. Craig is about as interesting as Fesser. But, I have a standard answer to people who are like, can you make a video about this? Yeah, if you want to commission the video, which means you want to pay me for my time and thought and for putting all of my projects on hold to do your project, we could do that. But it's pretty rare that people actually put their money where their mouth is when it comes to that sort of stuff. Although, to be sure, I've had, commissioned videos on Heidegger and Nietzsche and a few other authors as well. But I mean, why the hell would I want to do stuff on William Lane Craig, Joshua says, as machine intelligence is trained on the various views of ethics, will it naturally oscillate or blend viewpoints? Do you anticipate there may be new perspectives contributed? So machine intelligence, we should put that in quotes, because so far as we can tell, there's no intelligence there. And that's a pure metaphor. Trained, again, pure metaphor. And on the various views of ethics, boy, I would probably love to see what crap they are feeding as the various views on ethics, because the people who do AI stuff usually are not that well informed about philosophy in general. And I could imagine a lot of them just drawing stuff out of Wikipedia or Less Wrong or forums like that, and basically getting a lot of ethics wrong. So, garbage in, garbage out is a very old formula that we use in computer science. Something that, by the way, I mean, I was working with AI stuff back in the early 90s, back when it was expert systems and we were just theorizing about, basically machine intelligence is nonsense generators just on a higher level. So I am not optimistic about AIs, again, total metaphor there, not a real intelligence at all, being able to understand anything about ethics or having anything interesting to say about it, quite frankly. let's see. Here we go. Luke, how do you transition from reading primary works and secondary literature to modern academic philosophy? I don't see those as two different things. A lot of modern academic philosophy, we are reading primary works and secondary literature, right? So what do you think modern academic philosophy is if it doesn't involve primary works and secondary literature? I'm not sure what that means. Finger says, I read a ton of Hegel. I believe he was completely philosophically correct. Who let Hegel in here? Socrates' great-grandson. What do you think about the role community colleges play in higher education? Have you ever taught at a community college? Yeah, I've taught at two of them. I taught at Southeastern Illinois College as I was finishing up graduate school, and I taught here in Milwaukee at Milwaukee Area Technical College for about 3 or 4 years. I mean, I'll say this. So when it comes to talent in philosophy and intelligence, pretty widely distributed. People at elite schools like to think they're smarter, but they're not actually demonstrably smarter than the rest of us. They're just better connected and they have a lot of resources and they don't have to teach as many classes. So life is easier for them. But I don't think that they're actually better at doing or teaching philosophy. And, you know, when you teach at a community college, you either get burnt out or you get really good at teaching students who don't have an idea what the hell they're doing as they're coming in and often are kind of unreceptive. You get really good at reaching ordinary people. And I think that community colleges are great. You know, you can go to a community college, get some of your classes in, and do it much more cheaply. Like I had students in my intro to philosophy class at MATC who were taking the class there because it cost 1/10 of what it was going to cost when they went to Marquette, and they would transfer it in. And I'm not teaching the class any different at Marquette, which is a private, you know, university just down the road, than I am at MATC. I'm still teaching the same materials, using the same resources, all of that sort of stuff. So I think community colleges are really good and are important. Sometimes people, you know, like to look down on them. I think that, you know, they can be a great resource. So, all right. Luke says, what advice do you have for better relating philosophical ideas from text to real life and applying them? Well, the first thing is to ask yourself, can this actually be applied to real life and what would that look like? So, you know, sometimes there are already practices built into philosophical texts. Think about, you know, Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. So these Stoic thinkers who say, when you get into a situation like this, think about things this way. That's pretty straightforward. You're going to apply it, right? Or Plutarch in the Platonist camp. Other times you have to think about, all right, so given these ideas, how would I actually do something with them in real life? So Aristotle has this, you know, interesting, we often call it his theory of friendship. He doesn't call it that because he doesn't talk about my theory of or my doctrine of that. That's later people who like to paste that on him. But he certainly distinguishes between three main kinds of friendship. And you can say, all right, what would I do with this? And there isn't advice that I have to give you. You just say, how can I actually make this work in my ordinary life, right? I think it's that straightforward. Not an academic, what to expect for a philosophy graduate considering applying to law school, any advice or things to take into consideration before applying? I mean, we have in the United States over 100 different law schools, and they're all different from each other. So there isn't a like law school. There's this law school, that law school. I would say one of the things that you're going to want to do if you do go to law school and probably in the application thing, is don't try to talk about how philosophy is more important than or foundational to law, because they probably don't want to hear that, right? And you're just going to like close doors for yourself by doing that. And you're probably going to hear, if you do go to law school, you're going to hear some of your students and some of the faculty make fun of philosophy or stuff like that. And, you know, it's not up to you to be the defender of philosophy. If your goal is to get through law school, you just keep your head down and do your work and get it done, you know, and then go take the bar, right? Wherever you're going to be doing it. All right, Sunny Blue, if you could introduce, another good question. If you could introduce a historical figure or philosopher from the past to witness an aspect or issue peculiar to the modern world and provide their perspective or insight, who would it be and why? So, you know, we could think about like great thinkers. Here's a prime example. So I actually bring this up in my classes. Aristotle says a lot of stupid, poorly informed things about women, right? Like women have less teeth than men. All he had to do is open his wife's mouth and count her teeth, right? Or women don't have the rational part developed the way that men do, right? And clearly that's wrong. And I just imagine, this is what I tell my students, imagine that I brought Aristotle out of the past and we got through all the culture shock and he learned how to speak English and dress like us and all of that. And I brought him to my intro to philosophy class. The average intro to philosophy class that I teach in person is probably anywhere from 60% to 70% women in the class. And they usually tend to score higher than the male students, because the male students often are not all that well motivated, right? It's kind of a crisis that we're in right now. So clearly women aren't deficient in intellect or, you know, whatever, however we want to frame it. So, you know, we've actually made a lot of advances in terms of fostering equality, both of opportunity and outcomes and stuff like that, and social status. So I would love to bring him in and say, and then, you know, teach my class, have him see the female students like responding and saying intelligent things. And then he and I would go out to the bar or restaurant afterwards. And I would say, so, you know, when you're saying in politics book 1, XYZ, what do you think about that now? You know, do you want to take anything back? And I think Aristotle would actually say, oh yeah, I've got better empirical data to work with now, and I need to rethink these things that I've been saying. All right, Bellal says, what are the key Platonic dialogues everyone must read or contain most of Plato's ideas? Well, there aren't any dialogues that contain most of Plato's ideas. That's why there's a whole bunch of dialogues, right? So, and everyone must read. I mean, nobody must read any particular work of philosophy. So for me, that's kind of a non-starter. Scarlett says, where did you start with philosophy, as in reading books or articles, watching TV and movies? I'm just starting to get into philosophy and I'm lost. Well, so let's start with the last thing. You don't have to, as we say, boil the ocean, right? You just start learning a little bit of philosophy and you know, you work with that and then you'll find some other stuff. So don't worry about being lost. Just worry about finding a location, and then you can find another location and another location. I've written about this. There's an article out there called The Tale of Two Philosophy Teachers that you can find in my Substack. I had 2 philosophy classes in high school, one of which was terrible. That was the official philosophy class, both of which were, you know, one was an elective, the philosophy class. The other one was a required sacraments class. And the sacraments class was taught by a little guy who was a substitute teacher, Mr. Lorenzo, who wanted to focus on Augustine because he loved St. Augustine. And in order to teach us about Augustine, he had to teach us about Plato and Aristotle and Manichaeism and stuff like that. So, and he also taught in a philosophical way. And then, I read some stuff that I'd bought at used bookstores. The first philosophy book I ever read was Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. Understood maybe a tenth of what I was reading at the time. My Uncle Aim had it. I was like, can I read this? I thought it was about Greek mythology, and turned out it was about philosophy. And he was like, yeah, go ahead. I'm done with it. And then I got into some Nietzsche, and then, but I didn't understand what I was reading most of the time. And that's okay. Philosophy's tricky. I didn't have much guidance. And there certainly weren't the resources that exist now for studying philosophy, which are, it's quite nice to have, isn't it? So yeah, but the feeling lost, that's understandable. There's so much out there. Just worry about, like, if you've got some, like a author, just read their stuff and don't worry about understanding all of the allusions to other philosophers. It's okay. That can come later on, Here's another request. Same answer. A.B. Apok, what about a video on Alexander Pruss? I don't even know who that is, but people want videos. They can commission them. I've got a whole video about commissioning videos. I'm not sure why people don't know that if they want a video and they want me to, like, interrupt my normal routine, they probably have to, reach out to me about that, not here in an AMA. Luke Gray, what are your beliefs on how elenchus can or cannot lead to firm results? It seems that the authority of many premises in Socratic dialogues depends only on the agreement of the interlocutor. I don't know that authority of premises is an issue even in Socratic dialogues. I don't know what you're talking about there. Elenchus just means refutation. And how can it, what are my beliefs on it? How it can lead to firm results? I mean, I'm not even sure what's being asked there, frankly. It's one technique among many that Socrates uses and that Plato uses in his stuff. It's not the technique or anything like that. And Socrates is super clear that he's interested in the agreement of the interlocutor. And it's up to us reading it to decide whether we agree with it or not. That seems pretty straightforward to me. Useless projects. Did anyone have existentialist ideas before Kierkegaard? Yeah, that's why in literature on existentialism, we often talk about proto-existentialism, right? And who would be considered proto-existentialists? Socrates, Marcus Aurelius, not Kierkegaard, Pascal, St. Augustine. I mean, this is kind of a commonplace of existentialist thought. So yeah, people have all sorts of ideas before they're formulated into a one particular point of view. Duckasaur, how can a modern Stoic handle and deal with transphobia? I don't know. I mean, that's a little bit too vague. Deal with what about transphobia? And is it that you're worried about encountering it because you're trans or because somebody else is trans? I mean, I need more to go on for that. Philosophuncalist, early Heidegger, Being in Time versus later Heidegger of the event. There seems to be a disproportionate amount of work on Being in Time, fewer secondary texts available. Any recommendations? Why do you think this is? I think there's a ton of work on both. And frankly, I don't read secondary lit on Heidegger. I read Heidegger. So, and I actually don't think that there's that big of a, I'm not a big believer in the Kira, the turn where everything changed for Heidegger. I think that Being in Time, there's a continuity between Being in Time and all the later stuff. So probably not the guy to ask about that. Zane, philosophers who are into metaphysics discard or add into the former metaphysics, but never give any sophisticated proofs for their ones. They want us to accept them unquestionably. Why so? Well, that's a non-starter because you're wrong about that. I mean, Start with Aristotle's metaphysics and see whether he wants you to accept his metaphysics unquestionably. And once you figure out that you got that wrong, maybe then you can start again, you know? Ileana, thoughts on Moby Dick? Is it the greatest American novel, as some people say? I mean, what makes any novel the greatest American novel? It's going to be pretty subjective. I don't know what the greatest American novel is. I don't even know what I would consider the greatest novel to be, let alone what other people would say it is. Moby Dick is pretty cool, but so are many novels, you know, worth reading at least once. Luke Gray, do you plan on making any videos or series on moral psychology? Well, as it so happens, I've already made a ton of videos about moral psychology. I just don't label them moral psychology. You have to actually look at the texts and topics and think to yourself, oh, look at that. Here's the 3 parts of the soul, according to Plato. That's moral psychology, right? So, I mean, I've made probably at this point hundreds of videos on that topic. Into Cobb says, what, in your opinion, positive and negative effects does AI have on the field of philosophy? Mostly negative effects and wasting time as people buy into AI hype, whether positive or negative. I've already said AI, artificial intelligence, it's not intelligent. That's just a metaphor. Most of the people that are doing work on it, from what I can tell, don't really know what they're doing. And, you know, it certainly can be useful as a tool for some things, but we're not getting anything remotely like intelligence at this point. So I don't see it doing much with the field of philosophy other than creating, you know, work for people who are doing AI ethics or stuff like that. DPP, do you see it as a drawback that the whole of Hegel's works don't cohesively interlink to each other? How should we study the systemization of his individual works then? I don't see it as a drawback, but then again, I don't really care about having a big system, you know. So if that's your desire, I guess that's going to be a big drawback for you. But hell, not even every part of Kant's system work, you know, completely cohesively together. There's little weird quirks and stuff like that. I mean, you can study the phenomenology for its own sake. You can study the science of logic for its own sake. You can study the philosophy of right for its own sake. And that's valuable activity to do. Why do you need them to all be one big system? You know, I think that's the question you want to think about for yourself. Abba says all the smartest minds in history held similar views on women. What gives it they are wrong? Well, you're already wrong because all the smartest minds in history didn't hold similar views on women. So I guess you're probably not reading the smartest minds in history, because there's already a huge difference between Plato and Aristotle. And I mean, you'd know that if you'd read the Republic, wouldn't you? Because Aristotle thinks women can't develop the same intellectual facilities as men. And what does Plato say in Republic Book 4? So it's kind of a, non-starter there again. A lot of people asking questions. That are betraying some mistaken starting points. All right, Zane says, I think we can make objective moral evaluations based on our subjective moral propensities. People's moral subjectivism leads to moral relativism, losing any moral compass. What do you think about it? I think you got too many isms there and ofs and stuff like that, and you're working at this very high level of abstraction, and that's why you're winding up in those worries. Little bro, why a significant amount of philosophers are incels? I don't know that to be the case. I guess you probably don't want to hang around with the crowd that you're hanging around with. I guess you have a lot of incels in your friend group or social group, and that's why you would come to that conclusion. But I mean, a significant amount, I don't see any more in philosophy than in other fields. All right. Blank name, do you think Stoicism can take some insight from Lacan? If so, how would Stoicism incorporate concepts like death, drive, unconscious? I mean, I don't think it has to. Why Lacan? Why not any other psychotherapist? You know, I mean, Lacan is kind of this weird, wacky guy who may be right about some things and, you know, is awfully obscure. Why wouldn't you read somebody instead like Hans Kohut? Or why wouldn't you pick other psychotherapeutic approaches that are closer to Stoicism, like the whole cognitive revolution? So, you know, I'm not sure why we would want to do that. Scott Kent, what are your thoughts on non-existent objects like Pegasus or Santa Claus? Do you think they're simply abstract ideas? Do you think they have more value or reality in being in our world? I would say it depends on the abstract object, doesn't it? Right? The number one is not the same kind of object as Santa Claus is not the same kind of object as nothing is. So I don't think that we have a single theory or a classification of non-existent objects, right? Nerd Wizard, do you believe the rumor that Camus died a born-again Christian? No. And here's why that would be asinine. So born-again Christian, that's an evangelical thing. If Camus were to converted to Christianity, there's basically two churches that would have been a possibility for him. Most likely it would have been Catholic, right? And born again is not a Catholic thing, right? Because born again is its own weird, wacky, late modern theology that is based in a lot of weird stuff, right? But people love to talk about. And it means different things for different people. But that's an American Protestant thing more than anything else. That's not a French Catholic thing. And if he wasn't going to be a Catholic, he would have been a Reformed Protestant, because the Huguenots, the Reformed, that would be the other main religious option, like André Gide. That's what his connection was to. But why would we believe a rumor about that? Show me evidence. I mean, there is a rumor that Henri Bergson, who you might be mixing up with Camus, had a deathbed conversion, but to Catholicism, to the universal church, right? A church that goes back, as do all the earlier churches, to the apostolic community. Neither of them would be a born-again Christian, which is, again, an American category more than anything else. DPP, does Milton's epic Paradise Lost echo the existential concerns of the 20th century? How does the absence of yielding to God raise the same problems in the mind of both Milton and Dostoevsky? So Dostoevsky would be 19th century existential concerns, because that's when he was working. Echo the existential concerns? I don't see that. I think he's got his own shtick going on. Dr. Beavis, do you ever read When Nietzsche Wept, and do you have any thoughts on it? No, I don't read stuff like that. I got enough busyness with just like working on the text that I've got. I don't need to read a lot of like secondary or conjectural literature. German Cortés, do you think it's possible to develop a conception of patriotism which would make it possible to regard it as a virtue? Now, that's an interesting question. Yeah, it would, but it would be a very, very limited conception of patriotism that would look almost opposed to what most people, when they talk about patriotism today, mean by it, right? Because it would mean, so think about, here's a great example. We talk about the Puritans and Pilgrims and their importance in early America. And there's this great sermon by John Winthrop about the city on a hill, right? And when I used to teach religion and American culture, I would have my students read that, because sometimes people read that and they're like, oh, see, man, we're a city on a hill, American exceptionalism, we're so great and all that. And Winthrop is saying, no, you idiots. You are going to be held to a higher standard. You're going to be the city on the hill. So don't screw it up, you dummies, because God will punish you if you do. You have a unique opportunity here of making something out of your community that could, in fact, be a light to the nations. So don't screw it up, jackass. That's, sort of a paraphrase, right? If patriotism looks like that, I'm cool with that kind of patriotism, but that isn't what 99% of the people who talk about being patriotic mean. What they mean is my country is so cool and America first and all that. That's a vice. At least all sorts of vicious behavior. So, all right, here's the one that may turn into a joke. What are your thoughts on nothing? I don't have any thoughts. DPP, did Hegel already anticipate the world as a set of facts before Wittgenstein when he said all rational is real and all real is rational? So he didn't say all real is rational or all, he said the rational is real, the real is rational. There's no all in there. And is that equivalent to things being a set of facts? Not if you've actually read Hegel. So no, I don't think that those are even remotely comparable. Abraham, broad question. Do you think philosophy since Bacon, Descartes is improved upon or in contrast to earlier philosophical systems like Platonism, Aristotelianism, Scholasticism, Stoicism? Well, Scholasticism isn't a system. There's a whole bunch of different scholastic approaches. So put that out of your head to begin with. Philosophy since Bacon or Descartes is improved upon earlier philosophical systems. I mean, there's Aristotelian, Stoics, and Platonists today. So that is still philosophy since Bacon and Descartes. Alistair MacIntyre is a Thomist Aristotelian, right? Christopher Gill is a modern Stoic. So I don't think the question actually makes that much sense. And a lot of those early modern philosophers are incredibly engaged with those modes of thinking, right? Descartes borrows from scholastics. Discusses Seneca with Princess Elizabeth, arguably draws on Stoic ethics in the Meditations. So, I don't think there's that nice contrast that you're looking for there. All right, we're actually over time, so I'm going to see if there's something I can go out on. That's good here. Let's see. Here we go. Big King Burger, what do you think about The Will to Power? Is it really a misrepresentation of Nietzsche worth reading regardless? So you're talking about the book, The Will to Power, not the concept, The Will to Power. If you actually want to understand a thinker like Nietzsche, you don't just read one book, right? So any book that you pick could, I guess, be a misrepresentation. Like if all you did was read Thus Spoke Zarathustra or Beyond Good and Evil or Birth of Tragedy or Genealogy of Morals, you're not getting the fullness of what Nietzsche's doing. And yeah, it's supposed to be his last and final work. He actually mentions it, by the way, in the genealogy, but it's unfinished. And which will to power are we talking about? His sisters, let's steer it towards anti-Semitism and systematize it version, or are we talking about the sort of unfinished version? I mean, it's not going to be a misrepresentation of Nietzsche because Nietzsche's writing it if we're looking at the actual text, not Elizabeth Forrester's Nietzsche's edition of it. But I wouldn't, try to take it as like the last word on Nietzsche. And I think that's one of Heidegger's mistakes in his Nietzsche interpretation, by the way. Let's see, we can take a couple other ones. Vadisgrad, what would you consider the quintessential heavy metal album? What would you consider the most philosophical metal album? I wouldn't have any thoughts on the most philosophical. Totally depends on what we're thinking about. But the quintessential heavy metal album, I don't know that I could name one. I think I could name a couple that are really up there, but they'd kind of jockey for position. And this is me as somebody who's not like basing myself in heavy metal as it developed into a myriad of subgenres in the 2000s, but somebody who grew up listening to and kind of living out heavy metal in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So, I would say Judas Priest. It's tough to pick a album, but I'll say Screaming for Vengeance. I'll say Black Sabbath's The Mob Rules. Deep Purple's Perfect Strangers. Motorhead's Overkill. Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind. And Ronnie James Dio's The Last in Line. All right. You're really getting a lot of good stuff with those, I would say. And then let's take one other one. This is from Inticob. Do you think Michel Foucault is overrated, as his work is mostly strewn with esoteric jargon of his own, and he only deconstructs the structures in society, doesn't suggest any solution or change? Well, he does suggest solutions or changes. That's what he was up to in his later works, but he's not suggesting ways to change society all at once. He's talking about ways individuals can develop this notion of a care for the self, right? And going back to ancient philosophy to do that. Foucault, and this is something you can say about Lacan as well. Yeah, they love jargon, right? But they're not using it. Same thing with Deleuze. They're not using it just to have jargon. They're using it because they're trying to work out concepts. And sometimes some of the ideas that they have are quite helpful, valuable, I would say. And then a lot of it, some of it is overrated. But you got to think about who's doing the overrating, right? What are they up to? What are they trying to get out of this, And I think you can say that about a lot of different 20th and 21st century philosophers, right? They really do try to forge a new path, and sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. So Ibrahim says, can Seneca's philosophy of Stoicism be reconciled with his lifestyles, or does it expose a fundamental tension between theory and practice in his thought? I mean, he writes about this in his letters, doesn't he? So you already know the answer to that because you've read the letters. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking about what his philosophy of Stoicism is and how it fits in with his lifestyle. He's got letters where he actually discusses that. I don't see a fundamental contradiction between the fact that he had wealth and stuff like that, because he found ways to disconnect himself from that, and he was still in the end subject to fortune. He got stuck with this jackass Nero, who eventually had him kill himself. So a lot of people, and I'm going to say this, a lot of people worry way, way, way too much about, is there a disjunction between theory and practice? Yeah, of course, there's always going to be some differences between the two. The question is not, is there? The question is, how much? Is it so much that it makes you say, that person's a hypocrite? And, when you say that, are you actually being unfair to them? Are you looking at their stuff accurately? Or are you just doing it so you can make yourself, feel something in a certain way, or you can push them away? Or are they trying to do their best? I mean, Seneca talks about this in The Happy Life. He's got a whole passage where he's like, people expect, godlikeness from these philosophers. And he's not talking about himself. He's talking about previous philosophers. And that's ridiculous, So I would take a maybe healthier attitude about that. All right, let's see. Here's a good one to go out on. What's the main difference in Heidegger's and Hegel's philosophies? There isn't a main difference. There's a whole bunch of differences. Aren't they both phenomenologists? This is why it's really important not to allow a word to make you think that everybody means the same thing by the word. Husserl and Heidegger's phenomenology is very different than what Hegel means by phenomenology. And you really have to read both of them to see the many, many differences. And you can also, by the way, read a book. It's a short book by Heidegger about Hegel, which is lectures that he gave on the phenomenology of spirit. Unfortunately, he only went up to like the self-consciousness section and then didn't go any further. But, you know, there are some really big, big differences between them. One of them is that Heidegger has a different conception of history than Hegel does, right? And Hegel is a part of Heidegger's history, whereas Heidegger definitely isn't part of Hegel's because he wasn't around at the time. So, all right, that is a good place, I think, to leave off. And I'm going to end this. I'll remind you that if you want to study with me, I've got 2 online classes coming up starting next week. One is a 12-week Ancient Philosophers on Friendship. You can find it in the Study with Sadler Academy. The other one, for those of you who are interested in Hegel, is a 1-day seminar that's going to have 3 90-minute sessions on the master-slave dialectic, self-consciousness, and what comes after the master-slave dialectic, why it's not the end of the story for Hegel. So that might be of interest to some of you. And I'll say, have a great rest of the weekend and the month, and I'll see you next time.